name is Feliciano. I'm the academic director of CEBRI. It's a pleasure to have you all here for this the first international launching of our CEBRI journal. We have this partnership with Institut Montaigne, which is a great partnership. It's very important for CEBRI's journal to start our internationalization process, which is to outreach for more people outside Latin America, everything we produce at the journal. So we picked the fourth edition of the journal, which is the Geopolitics of Climate Change. It's our first launch, international launch. We translated all the articles that were written in Portuguese and Spanish to English. And now we're gonna, with this, we're gonna reach out to other communities outside Latin America, as I said. I'd like to also thank you, our sponsors that have been very, very important for the journal since the beginning. Klabin and the companies that sponsored the journal throughout these years. The journal is now going to its sixth edition that we probably launch at the end of this first semester. Which is here with us, and he's going to present this article of Transatlantic Affairs at Institut Montaigne. We have Fernanda Simini, which is one of our associate editors from the journal. She was the co-editor of the fourth edition. We have Karins Vasquez, who is a professor at the OPG no Global University and non-resident fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and also Joseph Delate, research fellow for climate, energy, environment at Institut Montaigne. Fernanda Simini is going to present the entire edition. Fernanda is a professor at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, a researcher, and she did her PhD at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and spent during her PhD she was a visiting researcher at the Political Science Department at MIT, and she's connecting us from Boston. But first, I'm going to pass the word to Luis from Institut Montaigne. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Luis, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Brazilian Center for National Relations, CEBRI, for this wonderful opportunity and for thinking of Institut Montaigne as a partner for the fourth edition of your international journal. So, muito obrigada pelo convite. So along with my colleague and today's speaker, Joseph, it's a pleasure to be with you all, and I'm delighted to be introducing this launching event around the geopolitics of climate change. And thank you also to the president, Jose, who you mentioned was connected, so it's an honor. My name is Louise Chadkari. I joined Institut Montaigne in May of last year, and I'm in charge of transatlantic affairs in the Europe program. So as you may all know, Institut Montaigne is the leading French public policy think tank. We are independent and nonpartisan. Our members are mostly French companies and small SMEs, which is one of our great assets because we are able to draw on their practical day-to-day expertise and use our close proximity to the business world to inform our work. So our domestic policy is greatly recognized in France and Europe, be it through our healthcare, education, and economic departments. We also have an internationally renowned Asia program and an internationally renowned Europe program, of which Joseph and I are a part of. So Joseph is our climate and energy expert. He sits on the Asia program, but he also works on European energy policy. And we also have another French colleague who works on all things environment. So that's just for the background information. On climate specifically, our work has focused on two thematic emphases for 2023, ways to effectively engage in climate diplomacy and industry decarbonization, especially hydrogen. So briefly on Climate Club, we published, and by we I mean Joseph published, a research report analyzing the political feasibility of a climate club between Europe and Northeast Asia, using a comparative analysis of climate policies in both regions. And this club aims to provide an additional format initiated by the Paris Agreement to accelerate and raise global climate ambitions. And second work on hydrogen and decarbonization. Institut Montaigne is also looking at the different angles of the green hydrogen debate, first by identifying issues underpinning the production and transport of carbon neutral hydrogen, and then by analyzing the hydrogen strategies of other countries like China and Japan. So we published a piece that offers recommendations for European hydrogen strategy, not only for the European Union, but also France. And recently, we published 2 policy papers on Japanese and Chinese green hydrogen policy, and all of these are available on Institut Montaigne's websites in English. So I will let Joseph tell you more about this / his work in detail and what his article on different carbon pricing instruments between Mexico and North America entails. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion on this important and timely topic in today. So again, a warm thank you to CEBRI for inviting us and for this opportunity. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. We are here with different time zones, Europe, US, Brazil, China, and other places. So first of all, I'd like to thank my dear friends and editors of this journal, Hussein Kalu and Feliciano Guimarães, for inviting me to lead this 4th edition of CEBRI-Revista on geopolitics of the climate change. I also want to thank the Institut Montaigne for making this international launch possible, and especially the work of Beatriz Pfeiffer and Bruno, who were responsible to translate and to bring this content with excellence in such a short time. So when we designed this edition, one of my concerns was to bring intellectual excellence together with diversity in terms of gender, race, region, and professional path, creating a mix of authors from academia and also from both the public and private sector. I'm very grateful to all authors that are on board with us in this edition. They managed to write their papers in a timely manner in a moment of many uncertainties and changes. At the time that this edition was being prepared, which was last fall because I was here already in New York, and we were all absorbed by the preparation for COP27 in Egypt. And also we were also involved in the following debates on the electoral process in Brazil. We were all following what was going on in this debate. And the authors were able to deliver their papers in time. And I believe this capacity to think and critically analyze the facts beyond the emotion of that moment is what make journals like this, like CEBRI-Revista, a trustful source to inform the public debate. So I am biased to say, I have to be honest, but the result was amazing. When we invited the authors of this edition, there was no editorial direction for theoretical approaches or some political points of view. In fact, our authors were free to choose their subjects according to their expertise and their contributions to the central theme of climate change and sustainability. The only requirement to be on board in this project was to pass through the strict evaluation peer review process that CEBRI-Revista has, and they all succeeded. So the result was an organic and orchestrated conversation that I will present shortly now, and I hope to continue this conversation today with Carrie and Joseph after my talk. So the main question that came up from our author's contribution is how can we unlock climate negotiations in the international arena with political pragmatism and at the same time make the climate agreements effective in practice. So the answers to this question are multiple, but all of them point to the relevance of Brazil in leading this process. So this edition is organized in 6 sessions, including my editorial introduction, the section of policy papers, the section of special articles which focus specifically on climate change and sustainability, the academic articles that are related to other topics, book reviews, interviews, and memory. But today, I organize my talk not by the format of those papers, but how they are connected or trying to make some connection between the arguments that they bring. So in the first part of this 4th edition, Ambassador Rubens Recupero, the diplomat Eugenio Garcia, and Professor Karen Vasquez, who is here with us today, offer an overview of the historical and institutional basis for Brazil's diplomacy to regain international protagonism in the development and sustainability agenda. The way I read these papers brings me hope, although Ambassador Recupero speaks of an apocalyptic truth in which the game of life has a limited time, and I do agree with him. But when I look at the history of the Brazilian diplomacy and all the contribution we as a country made for the climate agenda, I do believe that we are in the right path. But in order to go further, I agree with Diplomat Garcia that we should strongly invest in the green digital economy and that sustainability has to be aligned with the Brazilian innovation ecosystem. Professor Karen also makes a very accurate analysis of the institutional setting that we need in order to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. I will not explore the points that she brings because we have the privilege to hear her, to hear directly from her today. So in the second part, professors and researchers Matilde de Souza, Leandro Gomes Ferreira, Larissa Basso, Eduardo Viola, and Gilberto Câmara offer the empirical substrate for Brazil to take the lead in the climate regime, focusing on Brazil's current status of energy transition, gas emissions, and deforestation. Well, this part is a mix of hope and concerns. Brazil's relatively low carbon energy mix puts us in a uniquely favorable position in the decarbonization path in comparison to other countries such as BRICS and South American countries. But if, in one hand, energy self-sufficiency and the abundance of renewable source confer natural advantages to Brazil, on the other hand, political uncertainties and certain kind of oscillations in the funding arrangements for the low carbon transition raise some obstacles to achieve bolder and more effective goals. In fact, Basso and Viola consider deforestation the major problem for Brazil's greenhouse gas emission. In their analysis, policy to regulate land use and agriculture, monitoring enforcement are key for Brazil to remain on a favorable decarbonization path. Indeed, Câmara and al. Report that deforestation rates decreased by 84% between 2004 and 2012, when Brazil implemented a more active environmental control policy. However, according to the data presented by the article of Gilberto Câmara and authors, legal and illegal deforestation have significantly increased from 2019 to 2022 as a direct result of the Bolsonaro administration pulling down environmental control policies. So the current administration, and this is something that we discussed in our edition, has an important mission ahead to reestablish the institutional framework for climate protection. And last but not least, our edition also has a group of papers that offer insightful reflections for designing the Brazilian strategy to the next years. A strategy not only foreign policy, but also for domestic policies. This group includes some of the work that I've just mentioned, but also the contributions of my colleagues, Hussein Kalu and Feliciano Guimarães, from one of the founding fathers of CEBRI, Minister Celso Laffer, and from the diplomat Gelson Fonseca, who offers an homage to the diplomatic and intellectual work of José Augusto Linden Alves, who left us last year. Professor Kalu and Feliciano take a look at the geopolitical game, and they advocate that Brazil must urgently regain its regional protagonism in order to be able to implement a pendulum strategy at the extra-regional level. And this is important because as the climate regime turns from soft to hard politics, the capabilities that we develop in this regime is directly associated with this strategic game in the global arena. And I also want to highlight that this edition brings an interview with the Minister of Economy and Finance of Mozambique, Ernesto Marques Tonella. He talks about Mozambique's significant natural gas output and huge reserves, the third largest in the world. This reserve can be strategic to boost energy transition in the Southern African region. Another interview that we are very proud to share in this edition is with Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, who emphasizes the potential leadership of Brazil in the sustainable agenda, taking advantage of the presence of the G20 starting next year, and the synergy between Biden's environmental policy and Lula's favorable view of regional and multilateral climate cooperation. Well, I could spend hours talking about the readings of this special edition, but I want to take advantage of our guest speakers here to open this conversation. I think we can focus, as I know the work of both researchers and authors who are here with us today, that we can focus our conversation on the opportunities for developing countries, and also for these partnerships between Brazil, Africa, China, and the developing world as a whole. So I invite you all to go to CEBRI-Revista website and download the English version of this fourth edition of CEBRI-Revista. The format is very user-friendly and you can read in your phone. So I now, Professor Karin, I'm going to pass the word to you so you can explore more about your thoughts on the Brazilian strategy, and then we can hear the contributions of Joseph. Thank you so much.
Karin, can I just jump real quick before you start? Thank you very much, Fernanda. I think you put very beautifully a summary of the journal, and thank you again for helping. Without you, this edition we will never be able to finish this edition as it is. But as you can see, the journal has many articles. It has three types of, let's say, text, which is a policy-oriented text articles, academic articles, and interviews as well. And it's very, very difficult for us, as for any journal, to translate everything that was in Portuguese and Spanish to English. So I really would like to thank our English translator, Andre Winograd, who did a tremendous job in translating all this article. Our Spanish translator from Spanish to English as well, Sara Iñarte. And of course, the team behind the wheel here, which is Beatriz from CEBRI, Beatriz Pfeiffer, Caio Vidal, and Bruno Zilli. Bruno Zilli is a very important person. He's our assistant editor and a key person for the journal success. So thank you all the team behind the translation. And now, Karin, please, you have the floor. It's a pleasure to hear you again, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. Bye-bye. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Feliciano and Fernanda and Pio and colleagues from the Institut Montaigne for the invitation. I would really like to start by congratulating you all on the international launch of the fourth edition of the CEBRI magazine, and also for promoting the debate of ideas on the reconstruction and transformation, not only of Brazil, but also the world. And there is much that Lula government can effectively contribute to this process, as I argue in the policy brief, a strategic and forward-looking agenda for Brazil's sustainable development. And I begin by making the argument that the debate on foreign policy as a public policy has grown considerably since the redemocratization and the opening of the Brazilian economy in the 80s, 90s. But last debated is how public policy and foreign policy are articulated in a strategic and futures agenda that dialogues with the country's sustainable development priorities and the transformation that we see in international relations. And in the policy brief, I argue that this strategic and futures agenda can be thought as a two-way process in which foreign policy, on the one hand, informs and enhances public policy, while public policy guides foreign policy and gives the materiality for Brazil to exercise its soft power at the international level. So today, I'm going to present the three objectives of this strategic and futures agenda, and assess the achievement of the main actions proposed under each of these objectives, now that we have just past the first 100 days of Lula's administration, and it's a good time to take stock of where we are and what still needs to be done. So the first key objective that I propose in this strategic and futures agenda is to form partnerships and attract funding to enhance public policies in Brazil in line with international commitments made by our country. And just like the Paris Agreement stands for the climate action, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are another important conceptual milestone that we can use to put the country back on track with the commitments made under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the fulfillment of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, unfortunately, it's seriously compromised in Brazil. From the 17 SDGs, 7 of them have regressed or should not be met by 2030, which is the deadline for the SDGs to be met by all countries. 8 of the SDGs are stagnant, and only 1 has advanced or has already been fulfilled. So this is where we are in terms of the implementation of the Agenda 2030, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in Brazil. And amongst the most crucial targets that have not been met is the proportion of the population living under the national poverty line. We're 30 million Brazilians with no food living under poverty, extreme poverty. So this is very critical in other areas as well, that we have great challenges ahead. And what the point I want to make here is that this setback, to a large extent, and remember that during the Millennium Development Goals, the MDG agenda, Brazil was one of the countries that was actually doing quite well and completed many of the targets even ahead of the 2015 schedule. And why are we having such a different result under the 2030 agenda and the SDGs? Much of this setback is actually explained by the absence of a governance, financing, and monitoring mechanism for the SDGs in Brazil, and the challenges that this brings for the identification and the financing of public policies in priority areas for the country. The current government, Lula, has made a lot of progress in terms of recreating the national governance for the SDGs in Brazil. So the National Commission for the SDGs, which was actually proposed by some of us working with SDGs and including one of the recommendations made in the policy brief, was recreated. But the Commission and the Voluntary National Report on the SDGs, which is a report made by countries to assess the compliance with the 2030 agenda and what still needs to be done, they both still need to be operationalized. So it's incremental steps. I believe we're in the right track, but there is still a lot to be done to actually get these governance mechanisms functional. On the financing side, I believe that more efforts need to be made in terms of aligning the 2030 agenda with the investments by the National Development System, which currently comprises 34 development banks and other finance institutions in Brazil, with the cycle of planning, budgeting, and management of public policies in Brazil. And this is a crucial time as the next 5-year budget is being prepared, and to what extent this effort can be matched with the targets that we have to achieve under the 2030 agenda. And last but not least, chart strategies to leverage the financing of the 2030 agenda, not only through public budget and the national development system, but also the multilateral development banks, and especially the Inter-American Development Bank and the New Development Bank, which Brazil currently has the presidency of both of these banks, and to what extent we have clarity of how these banks can be the financing by these two multilateral development banks can be used to leverage action to accelerate the SDGs in Brazil and the world. A second objective of this strategic and futures agenda is to anticipate, assimilate, and understand many of the disruptive transformations that we are seeing in the world today, and promote actions to minimize the risks that these transformations entail, but also to maximize the opportunities they bring to the world and for Brazil. And here in the policy brief, I highlight three global transformations. Being the first one, the shift of the economic axis from the West to Asia, and the growing importance of China and the Chinese market for Brazil. The second is the inauguration of a production paradigm that has China a partner for the insertion of Brazil in the Industry 4.0, and also the search for leadership in digital agriculture. And the third global transformation is the energy transition. And in particular, what China's decarbonization and given the heavy weight of China's economy means for Brazil in terms of new trade areas, but also investments in low carbon industries. And here again, assessment of some of the actions proposed in the policy paper. We have made great progress in terms of qualifying our economic and trade agenda with China. I believe today, and especially after Lula's visit last month, there is a growing understanding that China can actually be a partner in many of the transformations that Brazil wants to undertake, and one of them, the new industrialization. And by new industrialization, I mean industrialization based on more inclusive, more sustainable paradigms. And mainly through the transfer of green technologies and investments in sectors with greater potential for job creation, potential for emissions reduction and integration with global value chains. But what are we still missing in this second objective? I believe that we still need to make more progress, look more closely at how we can cooperate with China in the generation and the commercialization of carbon credits, and this taking advantage of Brazil's national vocation to generate these credits and China's demand for these credits to complete its own decarbonization commitments. And here we can learn a lot from the cooperation that China and the EU have on green taxonomies and how to harmonize green taxonomies between the two countries precisely to allow for the commercialization of these credits in the future. But beyond China, I also believe that we need a more assertive stance towards India, and especially with regards to the role that Brazil can have in international alliances on renewable energies, as for instance, the International Solar Alliance that was proposed by India and France in COP21. So to conclude, the third and final objective in this strategic and futures agenda is the re-engagement and of Brazil's protagonism of Brazil's Brazilian foreign policy in the different regions and the different spaces of consultation and political economic cooperation. With China, again, we have made progress in terms of starting dialogue in the new alliance for poverty and hunger eradication, and this was one of the outcomes of Lula's visit to China last month. And this taking advantage of the experience of the two countries in the field, but also the importance that Latin American agricultural power has for China's food security and the role, and of course, the need to redesign food systems, and especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. and its impact on food systems, access, and sustainability. What we can perhaps look more closely going forward is how we can use IPSA, the India, Brazil, and South Africa alliance as a vector of Brazil's engagement in the context of the Indian, Brazilian, and South African presidency of the G20 and the BRICS over the next 3 years. But also create, looking more inside Brazil now, how we can create an ecosystem capable of bringing together state and non-state actors to articulate positions and infuse a perspective of a future that can help Brazil navigate with more confidence and purpose in this complex world. So very briefly, these are the 3 goals that I propose in the policy brief, and a brief assessment of where we are in terms of the action needed to take this strategic and futures agenda forward for the sustainable development of Brazil. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. So now, Joseph, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again for the invitation and congratulations again for the 4th issue. I enjoyed reading the many papers once they were translated, because I could not really understand anything in Portuguese. Unfortunately, Spanish was okay, but Portuguese is more difficult to me. So I really appreciated the focus you had on the climate change gridlock, and especially the international negotiation gridlock that we see happening on many topics since many years. So before moving to the presentation of my own paper that will be published soon in a future edition of the CEBRI journal, I just would like to have an introduction about why we discuss this climate club issue, either for Europe, but also for other regions of the world. As you know, I was at COP26. It was my 6th COP, I think. I followed the climate negotiation since COP20 in Peru, and I was very interested at first by the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, which was a huge success, as everyone know. But the devil of the Paris Agreement is that we don't have a binding structure to organize the global decarbonization, meaning that we do not have instrument to penalize people or constituencies or jurisdictions that are not doing enough. On this basis, we have to be carbon neutral in 26 years and a half from now, which is extremely fast. If we want to be sure to respect the Paris Agreement target. So what can we do? What can we do using the global Paris Agreement infrastructure that has been created after COP21? Before the Paris Agreement, there was a lot of discussion about the implementation of a global carbon price that was never achieved, of course, because the price needed in developed countries, or especially in high-cost countries like the US, would never be the same as the one needed in a country like Brazil or China or South Africa, for instance. And some countries are, of course, more emitters than others, but also have emitted more in the past and less now, but, you know, historical responsibility, and that's the origin of what we discuss in the common but differentiated responsibility in the Paris Agreement. So based on that, how do we actually organize more decarbonization? In Europe, we have since almost 20 years now a carbon market that has been growing in stringency for many years. We see now prices for carbon moving to $100 per ton of CO2. That has a lot of consequences for the European economy. Europe is now even going further, expanding the carbon market to up to 60 to 65% of the entire emissions emitted in the European Union. That means that people in the street, us, like the common people, are also going to actually pay direct carbon price for things that we do, that will have consequences for the economy, that will also have consequence for where are we going to buy goods. If we produce goods in Europe that are actually produced with a very high carbon price, well, the price of these goods is going to be extremely expensive. So there is a tendency that is called carbon leakage to actually produce outside of Europe and export the good to Europe in order to actually avoid these very stringent measures. And that's one of the very, very big issue that we see all around the world. Pioneering climate policy can be very expensive. It can be very expensive and not actually having the effect that you want it to have, meaning that it can actually have the effect to decrease emission in a region, but to expand the emission in another one. So that's a big issue that we have to answer. So now we move to the presentation of my paper, because that was the point of it. I hope you can see it well. I think so. It should be okay. So the name of the paper was exploiting synergies between ETS, which is carbon market linkage, so creating connections between different carbon markets around the world, and the establishment of a climate club to include developing countries. Because as I said, many developed countries tries to actually have their own stringent climate policy, and especially carbon pricing. But we don't want, by creating these measures, to create a fortress only for Europe, for instance, and not being able to have trade with our trade partners because of these fortresses that we have to build. So I took, and I'm not going to explain everything on this paper because this is only a preview, but we took the example of Mexico and North America as a regional example between a developing country, Mexico, and trade partners, which are Canada and the US, and how they could actually use their current climate policy to expand them together using the climate club architecture. Okay. So this presentation is based on two papers. One is the one that is going to be published in the CEBRI journal, volume 6, I think, and the other one is the big report Institut Montaigne did in November and published in November 2022. So what is a climate club? So I've already introduced the concept a little bit, but it's basically, it can be defined in many ways. It's a group of countries implementing climate measures together. That's the smallest definition you can have, the shortest one. It means to implement mutually agreed incentives and enforcement measures, for instance, a common carbon price, GHG emission standards, benchmark for carbon contents of goods, etc. That's concrete solution that you can implement in order to decrease your emission. Well, common carbon price, as I've discussed before, it's something very difficult to implement between countries that have different economic backgrounds. It's something that we see as a complicated mission for the international regime, a negotiation regime, but it's also complicated when it comes to climate club. So what do you need in order for a climate club to be actually implemented and in order to be effective? You need a compliance mechanism of a certain way. It means that you have to penalize the countries or the structure that are not moving fast enough. But that can create problem of fairness, problem of climate justice, etc. So you also have to take that into consideration. So what happened last year? The G7 implemented the first real climate club at the end of 2022. This climate club is nothing about carbon pricing, nothing about trade, etc. It's a very, very small and very, very thin climate club that just wants countries to come together and discuss about standards for sectoral, especially industrial sectors. That was championed by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in order to create the conditions for the German industry to stay competitive. Let's be honest, that was also one of the conditions for them to implement that, and also to create what the so-called lead market, meaning that you need, if you implement stringent measures like high carbon price, like GHG emission standard, as we see in the US, for instance, with the IRA, you need to create the condition for the market for carbon neutral goods to emerge. So that's the raison d'être of the G7 Climate Club that was launched in 2022. But of course, if you need to, the global emissions is not only in the G7. You need more than that. You need to actually enforce measures like that all around the world, and especially with developing countries that are going to be the ones that still have to develop, and so still have to use to use energy to produce many infrastructure, etc. So how do we actually expand the concept of climate club beyond developed countries? So the critical question is how to involve more countries beyond the G7. So the research I did was the critical role for Northeast Asia. So I studied this question for China, Japan, South Korea, and the EU. And for the second paper, the paper for the CEBRI journal, we discussed the question on how to include developing countries in the regional climate club using the example of Mexico and the US and Canada. So to move further to the discussion, what kind of climate club can be achieved? So how can you do using, for example, the example of Mexico, the US, and Canada? So let's take the carbon pricing question, carbon pricing and regulations, how to deal with divergent climate policy. Mexico, the US, Canada, we have like very diverse climate policies implemented, especially on carbon pricing. The US doesn't have a carbon pricing at the federal level at all. It's a political nightmare in the US to actually implement one. And so some US states like California, like most of the West Coast, East Coast, Northeast Coast actually, states have implemented carbon pricing, but not elsewhere. We have like Quebec in Canada. We have some other provinces in Canada that already have implemented carbon pricing. So what are we studying here? We are studying the differences between these policy measures in order to see which ones are the most sustainable and what are the point where cooperation is possible. I'm not going to dig too much into detail here, but basically that's what we did, and that's what we discussed in the paper. So can we implement a common carbon price through a climate club anytime soon? Our answer in this paper is that carbon pricing cannot be the main objective of a climate club, but a climate club should foster understanding and policy harmonization on carbon pricing. That's one of the roles we should actually involve by creating this climate club. But there is a big question happening now because the age of carbon border adjustment is coming, especially in the EU, but not only. So what does it mean, carbon border adjustment? Carbon border adjustment basically means to fight carbon leakage by putting a tariff on carbon intensive goods that are entering countries that are taking stringent climate policy. It's especially the case for the EU, but I will discuss a bit later why it's also important for the Americas with the US. So I put the definition of carbon leakage here, the EU one. We can discuss after if you have another definition that would be interesting, but basically the EU defines carbon leakage as the situation that may occur if, for reason of cost related to climate policy, businesses were to transfer production to other countries with laxer emission constraints. What does it mean? I explained that before. It means that it's a zero sum. If you emit your emissions outside of the region that has the stringent measures, well, that means that you are not solving climate change at all, because the emissions are the same, and you can even have more emissions because the regulation is even laxer. So what do we have here? This is like this figure, this image explain how the EU is seeing carbon border adjustment. There are three pillars. The first one, the three pillars to calculate how much a good entering the EU market now is going to have to pay for its emission. So there is carbon pricing abroad, so the carbon pricing in the exporter countries, carbon pricing at home, and the emission calculation methodology. So it means that we will compute the amount of emission that is entailed, for instance, in the car, and to produce the car, and then to make a calculus between the carbon pricing that have been paid in the country that produced the car and the carbon pricing that is paid to produce the same car in the EU. Meaning that if you don't pay any carbon price in your country, well, you will pay it when you enter the EU market. And that's actually something that is going to spread all around the world, probably in the next decades. The US, Canada, and other countries are actually considering the implementation of CBAM. I was a few weeks ago in discussion with Senator Whitehouse, which is a Democrat in the US Senate, and Senator Cassidy, a Republican, and both actually are currently writing for the Senate to legislation in order to implement the CBAM in the US, even though the US doesn't have a carbon pricing at the federal level. This is very American, and they try to implement a measure to adjust for something that they don't adjust themselves. But they say, and that's, well, you can advocate that this is valid, because they say the IRA and the US emission intensity regulation is going to be more and more stringent. So you need to protect the US market in order to be sure that just companies are just not going to produce elsewhere with more emissions. So divergence in climate policies between rich and developed countries and developing countries will create tension between trade barriers, but also for development. And that's an issue that need to be solved by using some new instruments. So we need instruments to promote understanding and deal with divergences during the ecological transition. So again, I'm not going to dig too much into detail of this very arid and very, very difficult table, but basically that's what was done in this paper. The difference between what is being done in Mexico and what is being done in Canada and the US in terms of carbon pricing, and we propose an harmonization framework in order to create this climate club. So Climate Club is to promote an understanding of CBAM, but also divergences between trade partners and avoid trade disputes. That's one of the purpose that could be entailed in the Climate Club. And the CBAM, well, especially if you speak about the EU, could be a compliance mechanism. It means that if you need to actually be sure that you pay the right amount of money for the emission you emit, so the polluter pays principle at the international level, what was never achieved through the UNFCCC, well, CBAM is one of the solutions. So the role of a climate club should be to enable comparability between measures. So let's say, for sure, countries can take their own options. Some countries will decide to implement a strong carbon price. Other we decide to implement standards. Some other we decide subsidies. So we need comparability, and that's why this climate club is a good idea. And of course, the second option, the second purpose is to promote carbon neutral trade for neutral goods. At some point, we need the carbon neutral good, especially for some critical supply chain like steel, for instance, to have the regulation stringent enough in order for them to be more profitable than traditional one that will always be cheaper. You will always actually have a cheaper coal-based steel than carbon-free steel. That will never be cheaper than a coal one. Look, finally, we made some recommendation. We believe with this paper that we need to take on the competition between members, to accept confrontation with non-members, and to use differentiated carbon border adjustment to promote participation in the club and as a compliance mechanism. So I'm not going to go that much into detail again, but we also promote the adoption of sectoral green certificate for countries that doesn't have carbon pricing mechanism, and to iron out the methodological comparability of policies, and to promote cooperation of the formation of green markets. So these are the four pillars. We can go back there if you have more questions. And this is like a description of the certificate that we advocate for. Well, thank you very much. Sorry, maybe I spoke too much.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Kari, again. Well, we don't have much time for debate, but I do have one question for both of you, if we have still some time to discuss. It was very nice and interesting presentations. And well, as an international relations professor and analyst, I always tell my students that we cannot end up talking about conflict. Actually, we have to start with conflict and with hierarchy, and then try to understand how can we manage these conflicts and the hierarchies. And in this case of climate clubs and green agreements, I was hearing Joseph speaking, And my concern is, well, he already showed that this is going to create another kind of conflict between developed and the developing world. It's something new that's coming up that we need to be prepared for those kind of negotiations. I'm very afraid of those linkages that we create in the international arena. In the past, we created the link between trade and property rights. And now we are here with a series of problems of this issue. And now we have a new linkage coming up, which is the green agenda and international trade. So I'd like to hear from both of you how we as developing countries can be prepared to enter this new game of this linkage between climate and trade. As far as you can see, what's the state of the art of this debate right now? Do you think, are we prepared? Are we thinking about that? Are we even considering this problematic as an issue in the near future? So I'd like to hear first from Karin. I know that she has some expertise in China and Brazil to share with us, and also from your same point of view, Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda and Joseph. This was a really, really interesting presentation and proposal, very concrete proposal. I actually agree with the fundamental motivation from what I could briefly assess from the presentation, and the concern with not exporting emissions to other countries and the need of a mechanism to prevent this from happening. And I see the potential of this type of issue arising, for instance, in the exploitation of rare earth minerals, for example, for the production of many of the solar panels, batteries for electric vehicles, semiconductors. So many of the products that are needed for this green revolution that will ultimately be exported back to these developing countries from where these rare earths are being extracted. But the extraction process itself, it's very has a high impact on the environment and the society. So what is the net effect, right, of this exploitation? So I think this is a very good example I've been reflecting a lot about, and which supports why I agree with the fundamental motivation for the creation of a club. But I also have some concerns or more question marks, actually, with the creation of a club from the perspective of developing countries. I think the idea of a club ultimately limits the engagements that you have, because those partners that are not in the club, they're excluded from the common rules that are being agreed with those that are in the club. And I think from the perspective of a country like Brazil, this type of segregation, it's probably the last thing that we would like to see, and especially in a world that it's already so much divided, right? And especially the current government values very much our engagement with other countries in the global south, and what types of disruption these types of clubs could create, and rules of where different countries could create in our engagement with other countries in the global south. And linked to that, the fact that many of these, if I understood correctly, many of these rules in the club are actually coming from G7 countries, right? Then yes, you can harmonize, you can coordinate, but they're essentially G7 countries' rules, right? So there's probably a limit to how much you can factor in consideration from developing countries, or how much developing countries will have to take these rules as set rules, or will they have a margin to adjust these rules to their own interests and priorities? And finally, a last very brush concern or question mark that I have is on the issue of the carbon border adjustments. It's being discussed within such club. I wonder why these types of new barriers, right, are not discussed in trade fora like the WTO, right? Which again, it's the Brazilian diplomatic tradition that values multilateralism and the resolution of trade disputes and these negotiations through the WTO. I wonder to what extent this could be the main forum for such discussions. But these are quick reactions, and thank you very, very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. I will try to be as quick as fast as possible, since I only have 3 minutes. And I'm sorry again, I maybe spoke a bit too much. So I will begin by the CBAM question. The CBAM question is actually something that is discussed, that is not discussed, that is implemented in the EU. We advocate that it should be a question also discussed between countries, not only at the EU level, because we believe that the EU as reason why it is implementing at the moment CBAM, but we should engage with other countries in order to create wider exemption for partners, and especially partners that are taking like climate policy seriously as well. We are not the only one taking climate policy seriously. So that's my first question. In terms of WTO, well, the EU designed CBAM as WTO compliant, meaning that it's an environmental measures. So to be clear, since the measure is put in practice in the EU where there is already a carbon price, so EU companies are paying the price, it's just equalizing for countries that are, for companies outside the EU that are actually entering the EU. There is no end of carbon pricing for. So when an EU country exports outside of the EU, it still pays the price. So there is no equalization at the end of the process. So it's supposed to be WTO compliant, but sure, there are some countries that are still willing to discuss this question at the WTO, especially India, for instance, at the moment. So it's an interesting debate that is happening right now. In terms of how to avoid tension and how to engage a developing country, that's the entire discussion we are having in this paper. I hope I made you want to read the paper because of that. It's a bit technical, but the question is, we need platforms, and this platform cannot be the UNFCCC because the UNFCCC is not created for that. We have some measures, especially the Article 3, that avoid the UNFCCC to take political decisions that are going against trade flows. So the entire UNFCCC process cannot actually discuss trade and climate. I agree with what you said, Fernanda, about linking the trade question with the climate question. But unfortunately, it's impossible to avoid it. About a fourth of the global emission is actually through trade. So it's not only transport, but also goods that are traded. So industrial goods mainly. So if you do not create the connection between trade policy and climate policy, we will simply not be carbon neutral in 26 and a half years. So that's a question we need to discuss. Since it's not possible to discuss it at the UNFCCC, we need platforms, not only one. And that's what we advocate at Montaigne. We believe that the club question should not be a G7 question. It's sure the G7 discussed that. If you want my opinion, what is implemented by the G7 is not nearly enough. And by the way, it's not only G7. The presidency of the Climate Club this year is Chile. So it's not even like they are way beyond the G7 already at the moment. So yeah, I'm afraid I cannot do more, but yeah, let's discuss this further if you want.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Karen. It was a great discussion. And just to finalize the debate, I'd like to thank you again, Institut Montaigne, for this opportunity. It's a great partnership. I'd like to thank Louise and Joseph, and I'd like to invite everyone to download the English edition of our journal. You have the website here on the chat. And invite everyone to read our next edition, and it's coming up in June, July, with Joseph's article on it. We will publish there, and it will be more information about his proposition. And I'd like again thank you, Karen, for being with us from China, 11 hours ahead of us, and Professor Fernanda from Boston to be with us here again. And thank you very much. See you in the next opportunity. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye. Thank you so much.
Ciao, ciao.